5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. If we're not, if we're still producing semiconductor, and while other countries already can kind of insourcing, produce those products, components by themselves, then what's the need for Taiwan? So I think we really have to think ahead. Not just right now, but also 10 years, 20 years from now. Are we still indispensable? Member. U.S. and Taiwan have this bilateral trade, initiative starting. So I think it does show that U.S. does value Taiwan a lot. It does recognize that Taiwan have this strategic role of producing these key components at these critical time. I think we cannot overemphasize how important Taiwan is right now in the world supply chain, and then how our decision can affect other countries' production as well. So I think we do need to kind of leverage on that a little bit for our own benefit.
Welcome to TaiwanPlus Point. I'm Catherine Lu.
I'm Rath Wang.
And today we're very glad to have two financial experts on the show to talk about the market. First, I would love to introduce a Reuters Taiwan Bureau Chief covering the region financial development, Ben Blanchard. Thank you so much for joining us. And also Charles Liao, Research Chief at the State of California.
Hello.
Thank you so much. Professor, the market is anticipating that the Fed will continue to raise interest rates. And also such doubts trigger that there might be a recession. So there's been the tug of war, the recession and also the inflation. And such fear has caused U.S. stock market and also Taiwan stock fall into a bear market. What's your view on the economy going forward?
Yeah, the past 6 months has been very, very interesting and very, very volatile, and for not just U.S. but all over the world. And the first half of 2022 was the worst half year in the past 50 years since 1970. Yeah. So Dow Jones was down about 15%, and Taiwanese and Korean stock market has down more than 20%. So this has been just really a bumpy half year. On the other hand, interestingly, the fundamentals or the economic indicator has just not been that bad. For instance, the labor market is really the backbone of each economy, and then the U.S. labor market, the number has been really good. Running red hot. The unemployment rate is at 3.6%, close to pre-pandemic low. And U.S. has recovered pretty much all the job lost during the pandemic, which was at once 20 million jobs. So that makes people wonder what's going on, what's causing this great divergence. And I do believe there are two reasons. One is inflation, the other one is uncertainties. The inflation, we know, as Catherine, you just pointed out, is at 40-year high. And the Federal Reserve is trying very hard to tame the inflation. And by taming inflation, they raise the interest rate, they are bringing down the balance sheet, and all these things are not good for the hot money. So the hot money is receding from the stock market, and also it's becoming more and more expensive for business to borrow money. And secondly, the uncertainty. There's a saying that business don't like interest rate hike, but they hate uncertainties, because uncertainty, they don't know what to anticipate. They don't know how to plan for the future. For instance, the Meta, the Facebook parent company of Facebook, they just reduced their hiring from 10,000 people to 6,000 people for 2022. So you can see that businesses are being very timid at this time of uncertainty. So this is a very interesting period of time. As a forecaster myself, it's very hard to see what's going to happen for the rest of the 2022. But I would like to kind of come back to the fundamentals, because the fundamentals, I think I'm still cautiously optimistic. The U.S. market, if you look at the consumption, the consumer is still spending. You can look at the investment; it's not as strong, but it's still going. And overall, it's been pointing at the kind of moderate growth, kind of soft landing situation scenario. So I think it's even despite all the uncertainties, I'm still kind of cautiously optimistic.
So you're saying don't be freaked out by the stock market right now just yet. Look into the fundamentals, going strong.
There are also voices out there that are saying that there might be stagflation in that sense. Do you see it going that far, or from your opinion, you don't see that we'll see that in the second half of 2022?
Yeah, I think that it's really hinges on whether Fed is able to tame the inflation. The market, they're right now on the tightrope. If they increase the interest rate too fast, too aggressive, they might push the economy into a recession. But if it's too little, too late, then the people might think, oh, the Fed is not able to do the job. So I think they're on this tricky situation. I think Jay Powell is probably having the hardest job in the world right now. I don't see the recession because in order to see recession coming, you're going to first see people are going to start draining their saving. Business are draining their cash flow, but we don't see that yet. So I think that's why part of the reason that I'm still cautiously optimistic, but I don't think we're at that point yet.
I see. Ben, so we know that central banks around the world seem to have different measures in this interesting timing. How is Taiwan central banks reacting to all these?
So far this year, we've had 2 interest rate rises by the central bank at their quarterly meetings. We had one in March, and then we just had our second one in June. So Taiwan Central Bank Governor Yang Jinlong has said that for him and for Taiwan Central Bank, interest rate rises are basically going to be driven by how Taiwan's inflation is going. Now, we've seen that inflation for June reached an almost 14-year high of 3.59% for Taiwan. Now, for year on year. Now, for Taiwan, that looks quite bad, right? Because it's 14-year high. But actually, comparatively speaking, Taiwan's inflation rate is still much lower than, say, the United States and also the Eurozone. So Taiwan has a different set of economic data that it's looking at. Obviously, Taiwan does pay attention to what decisions the Fed makes, and traditionally, Taiwan Central Bank meets basically the day after the Fed has its rate-setting meeting. So their next quarterly meeting is going to be in the middle of September, and the wide expectation amongst economists is that the interest rate is going to go up again. Now, the question, of course, is by what rate does that go up? So the last 2 raises, the last 2 interest rate hikes we've had in Taiwan have been by 0.25%. Now, Taiwan also has to balance economic growth as well, right? Like any central bank, if you increase the rate too fast, then you perhaps impact economic growth. But also as well for Taiwan, when you look at what policymakers have been saying about the economy here, actually we're not doing too badly here. There were comments from the economy ministry just this week saying that looking forward to the second half of the year, they were not pessimistic. Didn't use the words we're optimistic, but they said we are not pessimistic. And they point to things like Taiwan's economy obviously is very much driven by semiconductors, by tech, right? And actually so far the performance from these companies has been quite good. In fact, Foxconn, the very important Taiwanese assembler of iPhones, they've actually raised their business outlook for the year.
Speaking of semiconductors, we see kind of a trend where lots of countries that are, say, shared similar values, say from the US to Taiwan as part of the so-called democratic group of nations, which are also market economies, such as the same as when we look at China or Russia. And there's been a fragmentation in terms of the supply chain. How would you see that come to Taiwan's advantage? As you just mentioned, Foxconn.
Yeah.
So certainly since President Trump started his trade war with the United States, right? You've seen a bit of a bifurcation of global supply chains, right? So some companies you have one supply chain for China, and then you have one supply chain for the rest of the world. Now, what the Taiwanese government has tried to do with this is they've obviously tried to bring a lot of these companies that have been operating traditionally in China, they wanted to bring them back to Taiwan, right? More manufacturing here. But at the end of the day, Taiwan is still quite a small place. There are limitations on land, there are limitations on power, on water, on labor, for example. So actually also what the government wants to be doing, they talk about like cooperation with like-minded countries, right? Exactly, like-minded partners, like-minded countries. That basically means other democracies. So you look at the investment choices that have been made by some of Taiwan's tech companies, the most obvious of which, of course, is TSMC's $12 billion investment in Arizona. Right? But it's not just that. TSMC is also investing in Japan as well. Now, both of these are obviously for Taiwan very important probably Taiwan's most important international partners. So when you're looking at the reshaping of the supply chain from the Taiwanese point of view, from the Taiwan government's point of view, they seem very clearly to want to have more of this production either at home or making sure that it is in essentially friendly countries, right? And that's good for Taiwan as well. That's good for Taiwan politically, good for Taiwan diplomatically, because these countries which are big supporters of Taiwan, right? It's a bit of a quid pro quo here, right? It's sort of like Taiwan is nice to the United States or Japan, and then sort of and of course these are both countries which do back Taiwan internationally. Yeah, for example, WHO or something like, or places like that.
Oh yeah, Ben, and going back to where you mentioned how Taiwanese companies are coming back to Taiwan, how much have you seen these companies come back, and how effective are these government incentives?
So if you look at the figures that the government has provided, the figures are actually very, very rosy. And actually also, if you look at the investments that are going on at the moment, for example, in Kaohsiung, I mean, the Kaohsiung government, there is a lot of tech investment going on in Kaohsiung. When people think of when people think of Taiwan's semiconductors, when they think of Taiwan's Silicon Valley, right, most people think of Hsinchu. But it's not just in Hsinchu that Taiwan is producing semiconductors. Obviously, TSMC and others have plants in Taichung. But also Kaohsiung at the moment is an increasingly important place for a lot of this investment. Foxconn, for example, has broken ground recently on a factory there for making batteries for its EVs, electric vehicles, right? Which is a big growth area that Foxconn sees. They don't just want to be known as the company that assembles iPhones, right? They have very ambitious plans to go into the EV market. Now, obviously, not all of that is going to be manufactured in Taiwan, but some of it is. So certainly if you look at the figures, if you look at what the tech companies are doing, there is definitely interest here. But again, at the end of the day, ultimately Taiwan does have limitations on what it can do. I mean, this is a problem that the government is well aware of. They talk about they think they lack water, lack power, lack land, lack labour. And these are all issues that the government is currently dealing with, but not necessarily going to be able to deal with this overnight.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let's talk about the supply chain fragmentation, right? After COVID, after the war, how does it affect key industry here in Asia and also here in Taiwan in a bigger scope?
Yeah, the supply chain, just like Ben mentioned, it's really just reshaping. We're experiencing a very interesting period of time. I do agree with Ben that it does present opportunity, but I would also caution that it's presenting some risks for Taiwan's industry.
Political-wise?
Not just political-wise, but also it used to be that we what we call a long supply chain. You can trade, you can outsource anything to anywhere, despite the political view, despite the value, despite the goal. So you can outsource to China, to Russia, to anywhere, as long as they can make the product cheaper than you can. But the problem now is that the countries are now starting to group together, conglomerate based on the common values, based on the shared goal. The thing is that the countries are, instead of outsourcing, they're insourcing. Like United States, they are starting to looking at supporting Intel to produce their own many semiconductors. GM and Ford last year, they were forced to shut down their plants for days or even months just because they're lacking certain key components. So they realized these are strategic elements that Taiwan can provide. And Biden administration has been working very hard to support industries so that they can be self-sufficient. And that, I think, in the medium or long term could cause a risk to Taiwanese industry. If we look 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, if we're not, if we're still producing semiconductor, and other countries already kind of insourcing, produce those products, components by themselves, then what's the need for Taiwan? So I think we really have to think ahead. Not just right now, but also 10 years, 20 years from now. Are we still an indispensable member of this critical partner and a strategic using our strategic role right now to maybe gain some political benefits or gain some economical benefits at this point.
I want to dive in more about this concept because we've heard U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has called this globalization 2.0. How does it align with the interests of Taiwan in that particular concept?
It explains what globalization 1.0 was exactly what the long supply chain was all about. If you can partner with anybody, you can trade with anybody, and that kind of premise really start to break down. After 2010, countries find out that we don't get all the benefit from trade. Some countries are having a lot of income disparity. Some countries have a lot of environmental issues. So this is all due to trade. So countries start to look at is globalization good for the country, good for the economy? So hence the globalization 2.0, which is based on not based on just the cost or looking for whoever can make the product cheaper, but based on common interest and common and shared value. And there's a term called a small yard, high fence, which is the globalization 2.0, meaning that I'm going to start build up my fence. I'm still allowing some country to trade with me, but I will limit. I will kind of have the gatekeeper, allowing certain people, certain country to go through the gate. So that kind of mentality really start to form, and that really start to dominate the not just U.S. but a lot of the economies in the world.
And I would add here as well that so much Taiwanese manufacturing has traditionally been done in China. And these are supply chains that have been built up for, really years and years and years and years and decades, right? If you're making, say, assembling an iPhone in Kunshan outside Shanghai, right? There's a whole, it's not just one company, it's an entire ecosystem here. And for any company, and especially for the Taiwanese companies, you can't just expect them to pack up shop one day, move that, say, to Taiwan or the US or Southeast Asia, and just to immediately replicate that same supply chain that you've had for many, many years. It's not going to happen overnight. And there's definitely a recognition amongst Taiwanese companies that though they may be enthusiastic about building factories in other countries, about changing their supply chains at the end of the day. And it's, again, also for Taiwanese companies because there's a cultural connection, there's a language issue, right? If you're a Taiwanese company and you're operating in China, so you have sort of an inbuilt advantage, right? You're not necessarily going to have if you go and manufacture in Japan or the United States or Europe or Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of complex issues at play here. That especially for the Taiwanese tech companies that they have to think about when they're making these decisions. And obviously there's there's political pressure as well, right? We were talking about the pressures from the United States or the Taiwanese government. Yeah, exactly. And you get caught up in this politics that if you're a tech company or any company, it's like you're not involved in politics. It's a business decision ultimately.
So Ben, would you see that, say, TSMC, they're building factories in Arizona, and you see other companies, Taiwanese companies, that probably have the bulk of their manufacturing in China, but do you see these companies moving to the U.S. as part of this initiative, part of Globalization 2.0?
So we just had the first meeting under this new framework of the 21st century. So we had senior people visiting the United States, like John Deng, Taiwan's top trade negotiator. We had Gong Mingxing, who's the head of the National Development Council, the economic planning body, right? So actually, while that meeting was happening, or I think just after it happened, we had a Taiwanese company, Global Wafers, announcing a $5 billion investment in Texas, right? So that's a very tangible sign of of a Taiwanese company, right? So we've had TSMC, or we know about that, so Global Wafers is doing it. Now, actually, it's interesting as well. So the European Union has passed something called what they're planning as the European Chips Act. They also are very keen to get Taiwanese companies, not just Taiwanese, but obviously Taiwan with the expertise here to go and build factories in Europe Now, we haven't seen that happen yet, and actually TSMC, which had previously said that it was in sort of the early stages of planning a factory in Europe, actually came out recently and said, actually, we have no plans at the moment for Europe. So you have the interest in the United States from the Taiwanese companies, and tangible signs that this is happening, announcements. Ground has been broken on the Arizona plant for TSMC, but not for the Europeans. The Europeans so far have not been successful, despite the lobbying from senior European officials and actually high-level meetings that have happened recently between Taiwan and the European Union. So far, we haven't had an announcement from a Taiwanese company that is going to build for example, a semiconductor fab in Europe.
What Ben is trying to introduce here is a direct conversation. It's called the Taiwan-U.S. Trade Initiative. It has been formed, and it's led by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. And we can say it's unheard of before because it's very direct and it's very concrete. In your view, what is the benefit there for both sides, United States and Taiwan?
Yeah, the Taiwan-U.S. Trade Initiative, this is not a traditional trade agreement. It goes beyond that. Of course, it does have some components of trade. It does talk about some regulatory, science-based regulatory policy making. It talks about some of the agricultural products. It talks about some securing supply chain. It also talks about some of the issue that U.S. care much about, like labor, like green energy, things like that. You can see that the press release has been showing on the U.S. Trade Representative website. I do feel like the trade talk, when we talk about trade agreement or trade talk, it's both give and take, right? You give up something and in exchange of something else. We do see a lot of ask or take from the U.S. part. Of course, it does seem like U.S. is such a big country, and Taiwan is a key trade partner. But I do feel like Taiwan should, play its, kind of leverage on its strategic role. Taiwan being the key producer of semiconductors, and then I think it's, because right now the agenda we don't know a lot of detail, but right now the agenda shows a lot of ask by the U.S. part. I think Taiwan should, just leverage on our strategic role. Maybe ask more, in terms of political support, in terms of economic support, our visibility in the international platform. I think all these are a perfect opportunity for Taiwan to do that.
But in this interesting timing, why is this initiative making sense right now to the United States?
Yeah, because I think previously the IPEF, it did not include Taiwan, and it does include majority of the country, of course, except for China. It was really a direct, confrontation with the RCEP that China is forming, but of course it left out Taiwan. And only a couple of weeks after that, after U.S. and Taiwan have this bilateral trade initiative starting. So I think it does show that U.S. does value Taiwan a lot. It does recognize that Taiwan have this strategic role of producing these key components at these critical time. I think we cannot overemphasize how important Taiwan is right now in the world supply chain, and then how our decision can affect other countries' production as well. So I think we do need to kind of leverage on that a little bit for our own benefit.
There are views that IPEF is pretty much a political framework where the economic aspect is probably a bit less. But a lot of people in Taiwan are cautious about balancing between politics and also the economic aspect.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people have been talking about is a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement. Do you see these negotiations, or like Charles, you mentioned, there are a lot of concessions that Taiwan might have to make from demands from the U.S. Do you see with this, would Taiwan be able to get what has long been talked about as a FTA?
Yeah, it's always tricky in economic theory. It's always hard to trade with a large country. They have what we call monopoly. They are the sole buyer, the biggest buyer of your products. But I do feel like I want to bring up some data points. Like U.S. contribute to about 13% of Taiwan's trade, And the biggest contributor of Taiwan's trade is still China and Hong Kong. So it's about more than 1/3, about 34%. So while we are talking about it's hard not to talk about politics when we talk about economics, but how to balance that that delicate role. And also at the same time, we do want to partner with countries that we share the same value, have the same goal, but we want to be kind of nimble. We try to be flexible, and also in these trade talks, we don't like I said before, be strategic, be kind of leverage on our comparative advantage, and at the same time, try to hold our grounds.
But I want to bring this high concept down a little. How is this new surroundings, environment, interest rate hikes, and new frameworks going to affect Taiwan on a business level, specific sectors, employment, foreign investment? Is there any aspect you want to talk about specifically, the changes?
So what I would say is that over the last couple of weeks, you've certainly seen some quite apocalyptic sounding or very worrying sounds coming from, most recently I can think of, from the Bank of England, for example. I mean, you hear it out of Europe, you hear it out of the United States. You hear this from top policymakers, but actually in Taiwan you don't, or at least not so far. Still, the noises that are coming out of policymakers here, they are still quite optimistic. Companies are still relatively optimistic as
not
well.
That worried.
Looking for, they're still relatively. No, the R word, recession, right? This is not something that so far has come up in Taiwan. We are still expecting the overall economic growth rate this year. I mean, it's been downgraded by both the central bank and the statistics agency already, and will possibly be downgraded again. But even if Taiwan's economy grows 3% this year, that's still pretty good, right? It's still not bad. Well, I mean, certainly you're looking at, as I say, you're looking at some of, especially out of Europe. I mean, Europe, of course, very much impacted by what's going on, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion. But, and Taiwan, ultimately, the economy here does rely very much on what goes on in China. We have been through a period of great uncertainty in China, and some because of the COVID lockdowns. That may continue to happen, but obviously for China, it's not in Xi Jinping's interest for the economy to slow too much. So at the end of the day, Taiwan could still be okay. And also Taiwan's role in the tech supply chain. Now, you look back 2 years ago to the start of the pandemic, right? At the time, everyone was very nervous about what was going to happen to Taiwan's economy with the pandemic. Actually, Taiwan was one of the great beneficiaries of the pandemic because it was producing the cell phones, the tablets, the laptop computers, and the servers and stuff. Exactly, the new online era, this sort of work and study from home. So Taiwan did very well out of that. And that was a surprise at the time. That's really helped propel Taiwan's economy for the last 2 years. A very good economic performance last year. So of course we're in the post-pandemic era now, right? That same level of demand is not necessarily going to come. But again, if you talk to, if you look at what people are saying in the industry, and if you look at what Taiwan policymakers are saying, it's like, well, we're still managing to leverage demand for our tech from things like EVs, from things like high performance computing, from like servers. I mean, this is not a particularly sexy issue. It's not something you would go out and buy. You're going to buy a server on the internet. But this is very important for the cloud, right? Amazon, Microsoft, things like that. And actually companies in Taiwan are a very crucial part of this supply chain.
Storage as well. Yeah.
Storage, exactly. So far, people are still relatively, as I said, using that expression, the economy ministry said they are not pessimistic. They are not pessimistic about the outlook, certainly for the second half of the year in Taiwan. Now into next year, it's probably still, from my point of view, it's a little bit too early to say.
It's great how you mentioned semiconductors and industries that Taiwan has long focused on. But outside of this semiconductor industry, which industries do you think there's still growth potential? And as Charles mentioned, there are other industries that we probably should focus on outside of just putting all our eggs in the semiconductor industry.
I mean, for Taiwan's economy, the semiconductor and the tech industry, it does tend to draw the oxygen out of the room for almost every other industry. I mean, Taiwan does have other industries. Taiwan is in Taiwan, the government has a policy for for lowering carbon emissions, for being carbon neutral by 2050, right? So a lot of investment we see is going on in Taiwan is going on in wind power, for example. Not just wind power, there are other renewables as well in Taiwan. There's solar power, but I think one of the most visible things, you can see it when you fly into Taoyuan Airport on a clear day. You can see the wind farms that are all out in the Taiwan Strait, right? So this is actually certainly something which is good for the foreign investment community, because actually a lot of these companies, there's a lot of European investment going on here as well. And this is definitely going forward a growth area. One thing I would mention that I think also people forget, because Taiwan has been essentially locked down from the outside world for the last 2 years. Actually, Taiwan was becoming a very fashionable tourist destination. We had a lot of low-cost flights coming in here, not just from traditional markets like Japan and South Korea. I mean, increasingly from Southeast Asia. The government has a policy, its new southbound policy, right? It wants to cultivate closer ties with Southeast Asia. Now, of course, one aspect of that is getting Taiwanese investment down there, building factories in Vietnam or Thailand or Malaysia or whatever. But also you were getting a lot of tourists coming here. Now, of course, Taiwan is never going to be like Thailand or Malaysia in the sense of how much tourism is an important part of the economy. But certainly it was a growth area. And our borders still remain closed. At some point, possibly quite soon, they will open up again. And I would imagine that this tourism industry is going to start coming back. But I would stress, this is still a relatively small part of Taiwan's economy. It is still quite niche.
I see. Before we wrap everything up, I want to talk about the China market. Because right before the CCP 20th National Congress, some predict that if you look into the stock market, it's actually steadily rising, right? And some predict that it's going to bullish. But right now, it still remains a zero COVID policy. Does that mean we can be cautious, optimistic for investors?
I think it's still too early to say that China is going to have a bullish market for the rest of 2022. I do think that right now we're seeing the stock market is the rebound from the lockdown in April and May. And then additionally, I think it's hard for me to imagine China can be immune from all the business investment or the slowdown of on the U.S. side. After all, China is the hub of the international manufacturing products. We see that Apple is potentially cutting back in their orders, and then Nike and some of these key manufacturing companies, they're just not sure about how 2022 is going to be. So they're being very, very timid. And I do think that's going to affect Chinese exporting sector directly. So I think it's still too early to say. And then if something that China showed the world is that the politics trump the economy. They in order to attain certain.
Are we talking about the policy, zero COVID?
Zero COVID policy, yeah, or any policy. Like if they're in order to attain certain policy, they would even close down this.
Forgo the economic.
Forgo the economic benefit, and even one of the largest city in the world, Shanghai, they're just able to shut it down. And then shutting down a city is not like shutting down a light switch. When you turn it back on, it's turning back on. It's not like that, because when you shut down, when people are locked down, you lose jobs, and people lose jobs, and people lose their livelihood. They probably won't be able to come back to their original position. Some of the business might be closing down. So all those will be kind of added cost to China. So I do think that right now it's probably still too early to tell.
Have you seen people or companies move out of China to Taiwan, adding on what you said of the uncertainties in the Chinese economy, or is this an opportunity to?
I mean, Ben probably would know a lot about that, but I do think that for companies that does not require a lot of network of supply chain, they're easy to pick up and go. Like manufacturing, like shoe factories, these factories. But regarding more of a kind of semiconductor or more advanced manufacturing product, is probably hard to just kind of pick up and go. So we do see some of that coming back to Taiwan, but it depends on the industry.
Thank you so much, Charles and Ben. Charles just been back to Taiwan for 2 weeks, and thank you so much for joining us on the show. Thank you so much for providing your insights. That wraps everything up. Thank you so much for watching TaiwanPlus Point. I'm Catherine Liu.
I'm Rath Wang.
For more information, please download TaiwanPlus app. I'll see you next time.